So I thought I'd talk a little bit about my work here at the Museum of Anthropology, and particularly a major project that was on the go before I came to the museum and that built out of the task force report on Aboriginal peoples. And that was, the grant application went to the Canada Foundation for Innovation. It was called A Partnership of Peoples. It was based on the idea that collaborative practice was the way forward for museums in the 21st century. And basically it was to rebuild the museum, both the physical research infrastructure and to create a virtual research infrastructure. So for the physical research infrastructure, we created an entire area that was a space for communities to come into when they arrive, a lounge for people to be in, proximate to a space for oral history and language, to the archives and to the collections, along with a culturally sensitive storage space and a space where people can view culturally sensitive materials, and communities that need to do burnings or smudgings can do those kinds of activities. So that was a really major project. So as I mentioned, there was a physical research infrastructure component to it that also involved the archaeology collections, because another thing that we wanted to do was to try to break down the silos that the Academy has created that Indigenous communities don't see between archaeology and anthropology and history, and to have everything together, and contemporary art, right? It's all part of the culture of the people. So putting those together, and so the archaeology facilities were also redone as part of that, and I played a role in the archaeology facilities. But the piece that I want to talk a little bit about was the virtual research infrastructure called the Reciprocal Research Network. And when my colleague Anne Stevenson, who had been the lead of that project, went away to do her master's in library and archival and information studies, I took over the lead of that aspect of the project. It was, the purpose of the Reciprocal Research Network was to create a virtual research infrastructure to connect communities, lands, stories with belongings, and museum professionals and academics. So it was to take that idea of, well, this museum is known for something called visible storage, which we now refer to as the Multiversity Gallery's Ways of Knowing, where much of the collections are on display. But how do you take that outside the physical structure of the building to places where people can't, to communities that can't get here, to researchers who can't get here? So the idea was to use an online website to create that kind of presence. And the other thing that we wanted to do with that was, rather than just to develop it ourselves, we did it as a co-development project. So it was the Musqueam, the Umista Cultural Society in Alert Bay, the Stalo Nation and Stalo Tribal Council, and the Museum of Anthropology, all coming forward to do this as a co-development. And I was the lead, so the member of the steering group for the Museum of Anthropology. And one of the exciting things for me is to be part of a co-development project was to take that to another step of what Chip Colwell has referred to as the collaborative continuum. So to take this to the space where it's not just what the project looks like or how the project rolls out or the process of the project, but it's actually also the budget of the project, all these important decisions that are being made, that frequently are made by one group, even in a collaborative project, was being made by all of us together. We also had, at the beginning, 12 partner institutions who said that they would be willing to work with us to look at how this virtual access to collections might be structured. So that was a 4-year project. We did it using something called Agile Software Development Philosophy, which is a philosophy whereby, unlike much software development in the past, where you would create a binder of all your requirements. You'd hand it over to the software engineers who seem to live in some sort of other office somewhere. They would go away, create it, and bring it back and say, here you go. Here's your product. So we actually brought on board just finished students from UBC as the software engineers for the project. They worked with the communities, they worked with the museum, they worked with our museum partners to develop the project. And the way that they did that was that within 6 weeks of them starting work, they had taken one collection, the collection from the Museum of Anthropology here, and they put it in a system and said, okay, now let's play with it. Let's look and see. So we'd take it out to communities and we'd say, we started by going to Stalo and talking to the Stalo House of Respect Caretaking Committee and saying, what do you like about websites? What don't you like about websites? What's easy to use? How would you want to search for something? And we also talked to researchers. So we were hearing from people what they found frustrating, what they found useful, how they wanted to be able to search. So it was done in this continuously iterative project, which is part of the Agile software development philosophy. But also going back and forth with communities running. We had community liaisons. So when something new would come about, we'd take it to the communities, get it tested, bring it back. We also ran into all kinds of interesting issues with jargon, even within the museum professionals, where people would start talking about a word and one group of museum professionals, the archivists would interpret it one way. I would be sitting there as a trained archaeologist going, I don't know what you mean by that word. Communities were going, we interpret that differently. And then having to sit around and come to a consensus as to why something was causing a challenge for a particular institution. So that took us about 4 years to develop and to do. The idea is that communities, museum professionals, researchers can work together on projects. They can choose to work individually on projects. They can make projects so that if you were part of the group, you could find out that the project existed and say, hey, I know something about that, can I join? Or they can make it so you can't see it. So all these different dynamics were built into it. So it still exists, it's still running. So the Reciprocal Research Network, it's rrncommunity.org, and it has now 26 different partner institutions who contribute information about cultural heritage in their collections, and people can then come in and do the work that they need to do within that space. And again, that was, for me, a project that really spoke to the fact that being flexible and adaptable is one of the keys to making any project work. When we first started, none of the steering group members had any experience in doing a software development project. And we had a little while, we had a professional project manager who told us 93% of software projects fail. Not the kind of thing you want to hear when you actually don't know what you're doing. But fortunately, we persevered. And the other thing that was fascinating to me about the project was that each of the different groups had a different reason for being part of the project. So Alert Bay is well known. The Umista Cultural Society is well known for its amazing work on repatriation, on the potlatch collection that was illegally seized by William Halliday at the potlatch in Village Island in 1921-22, and the way that the cultural heritage from that seizure was dispersed to the ROM, to the Canadian Museum of History, to private collectors, and how they've been managed over time and through perseverance and hard work to bring that collection back together, both at Umista and at the Nyamblis Cultural Center. So they were very interested in what are ways that we can visually bring our heritage, keep our heritage alive. So they were interested in seeing what else is out there from our cultural heritage. Musqueam, as I said, has been formational in this museum in pushing us to think about who we are and what we're doing, and about the roles and responsibilities of museums to share back the heritage that they have had in their storerooms frequently for a century, in the case of the coast here, and without people here really knowing that it's even there. So that's part of that. And then Stalo Research and Stalo Nation and Stalo Tribal Council, part of their interest in being part of the project was the sense that they've run a lot of field schools, a large number of field schools for university students in archaeology and in ethnography and anthropology. And they run those field schools with universities, Victoria, Saskatchewan, UBC, Simon Fraser, on purpose, in the grounds that by training the young professionals of tomorrow, they will change and alter the practice, right? Which is a great way of doing it. And so their interest in this was the continuation of that way of thinking and moving their thoughts and their desires and needs for their community forward. And then the museum, it was partly this idea of how do we assist collaborative practice to happen? Is there a way that we can the internet be used to help to foster and engender trustful and respectful relationships across disparate communities and across geographic distances? So part of that was that. So that I was also involved in that project. So yeah, that's that one. So try it out. Yeah. All right. Then where were we going to go? Oh, repatriation? Do you want to go to repatriation? Okay. I try not to link the two. I'll say that. I actually try not to link the two. I try not to link the Reciprocal Research Network work and the work that I do with repatriation. I try not to link the two because I take the view, this is a personal view, I take the view that repatriation is the return of whatever it may be, or if it's ancestral remains, whoever it may be, to the rightful community, and it's theirs. They make the decisions as to what happens. The power is also returned. So for me, I don't view the Reciprocal Research Network as repatriation. I view it as providing access to knowledge, knowledge sharing, knowledge mobilization, collaborative practice building, those kinds of things I view it as, but I don't view it as repatriation because it's not the return of control. Does that make sense? Okay. So another project another area that I've been involved with is repatriation of ancestral remains. And that work I do as part of my work with the Department of Anthropology, which runs the Laboratory of Archaeology. And the Lab of Archaeology was started by Charles Borden in somewhere around 1949. The history's a little bit hazy. Apparently he and the university president crawled through a broken window into the basement of a room and said, yes, this looks like the right place. So we all have wonderful origin myths, but that's the one for the Lab of Archaeology. And I love the idea that a university president is crawling through a broken window somewhere. So the Lab of Archaeology caretakes collections primarily from British Columbia. As a result of that, and as a result of who Charles Borden was, there are a number of ancestors that have ended up within our caretaking. And they've ended up here for all kinds of reasons. People always want to know, how come? Why do you have them here? So some ancestors came here through excavations. Some ancestors came here through the RCMP. So the RCMP in the past, they would get called to the scene of the discovery of bones. They would determine that the individual had not passed away recently. And there was a period of time when they would just then, rather than turning around and saying, whose ancestor is this, they would then turn around and send the ancestor here to the Lab of Archaeology. Construction workers. All kinds of ways that ancestors have arrived here. But this is a new museum. 1948, 1949 was when this museum was founded, so it doesn't have that same history that we find in many museums of collectors who are going out and walking into graveyards under cover of darkness and walking out with individuals. But there are individuals here for a number of reasons in the Lab of Archaeology. And one of the things that I was particularly interested in was the issue of power and the issue of how do people even know where their ancestors are. Canada has a policy, it's not following on from the Spirit Sings exhibition with the Calgary Winter Olympics. There was a task force across the country of First Peoples and museums. And as part of the task force report, one of the things they talked about, this is 1991, 1992, they talked about the need for repatriation and for repatriation policies. And museums across Canada signed on to that and said, yes, repatriation is a good thing. But unlike the United States, there are no laws in Canada that dictate that repatriation must take place. There's an exception to that, but I'm not going there. And so, as a result of that, it's like in the United States, people had to make inventories. And then they had to publish the inventories, and they had to send the inventories to the communities. Any federally funded museum had to do those inventories and send them to any federally recognized First Nation or Native American group, because it's only south of the border. In Canada, despite the fact that we all said repatriation was a good thing and we signed on to the task force, that's where it ends. So we say it's good, yes, and we have policies. We have very strong, straightforward, step-by-step policies. But how does a community even know that there is an ancestor at your institution to ask for, right? So I thought there's an interesting imbalance. If there's no way for anybody to know that they have an ancestor here, they're never going to come. So even though we're not saying we're holding on to, are we de facto holding on to an ancestor when we should actually be talking to the community? So I think it's 2004, maybe 2005, I worked with Kristen Hausler, who was a student in the law faculty here, and with Patricia Ormerod, who's our lab manager, and we created a listing of the ancestors that were here, and then we also started mapping them out as to the different territories within BC. And then we sat down and we crafted a letter inviting communities to contact us. And we went down and spoke to Leona Sparrow at Musqueam, and we gave her the draft of the letter, and we said, what we didn't want to do was send out a letter saying, the Lab of Archaeology thinks we have 16 ancestors from your community. What do you want to do about it? Right? Because again, that's us dictating. So in fact, the letter came out saying, we're starting this project. It's called The Journey Home. We're writing to you because we may have ancestors from your traditional territory. If this is something that you would like to follow up on, please contact us. And anything that you send us in ways of a map, we'll treat in confidence. And then we sent those out to every community in British Columbia, that we thought we might have ancestors from. So we sent that letter out to 125 different communities. And some communities got back to us instantly, and some communities got back to us many years later, because one of the things that we learned coming out of it is that it's an ongoing process, and it depends on when communities are ready to do that work. And so people are always like, have you finished that project? Like, no, that project hasn't been finished. So the journey home is an ongoing project. And we just put out a really interesting paper that you might want to have a look at. One aspect of the journey home was working with Stalo House of Respect and Caretaking Committee, and Dave Sheppy, and I had a small grant from the Intellectual Properties in Cultural Heritage Project to talk about repatriation. And so the repatriation that we did with the Stalo House of Respect Caretaking Committee and the Lab of Archaeology, that report is actually available online. One of the things that's interesting about it is most times, most people are unaware that museums across Canada are doing are doing repatriation all the time. We're working with communities, we're returning ancestors, cultural heritage materials are going home, but most of those are done in confidence. And if the community doesn't want to publicize it, then we don't publicize it either. So people are unaware of what's of the work that's being done. The nice thing about the report that Dave, the House of Respect Caretaking Committee, and I was a small part of, have online is that the House of Respect Caretaking Committee allowed the full minutes of 2 of their meetings to be included. And so you can actually hear the community members talking about why they made the decisions that they made. And they made some very interesting decisions that have to do with, when you're talking about repatriation of ancestors, one of the things that communities often want to know are some of the research questions. What can be told with non-destructive analysis, right? So where you don't have to take a fragment of the individual, and what kinds of information can you tell from destructive analysis? And when you do destructive analysis, is everything gone? And how do you treat the bit that's left, if anything's left? So part of the project was walking through all of those kinds of things and having the community make the decision whether they wanted to do any non-destructive analysis, which they did, and whether they wanted to do any destructive analysis, which they also chose to do. They chose to do some radiocarbon dating. They chose to do some isotope analysis. So it was the fact that they were the ones making the decision, not someone like myself making the decision about the research, and then hearing back and gaining back the stories, listening to the biographies, then the rich biographies of the individuals that were coming home. So yeah. So the journey home continues, and as I said, we work with community whenever they step forward, and then work with them to determine how they want to work through the process, how they would like to see their ancestors come home, and what kind of work, if anything, they would like to see done with their ancestors as part of that journey. So yeah, so the journey home has also been a tremendous learning experience. I think that's one of the things we're all enjoy, right? Is the fact that we're constantly learning new things from people.